Neues Schlagwort des Tages, Bruno Gröning.
A new headline of the day. Bruno Gröning, the man who in Herford, Westphalia first came to our attention through his unusual healings, has since moved to Rosenheim in Bavaria. Since then, masses of help seekers and curious people are camping out in front of the Traberhof at Gröning's current living and working quarters. Gröning's strange powers, the news of his past successes and the...
In 1949, the journalist Dr. Kurt Trampler was a witness to the events in Rosenheim at the Traberhof. In retrospect, he writes,
Gröning's meeting with untold thousands of help seekers was an occurrence of dramatic impact. The apocalyptic paintings of the masters of the Middle Ages appeared to become reality when you took in the horror of what had led these people here. All the incurable diseases, wounds, mental disturbances, and the numb terror of the people who'd hidden themselves shyly away from the gazes of the idly curious. They were now inexorably and unavoidably visible. These people who were waiting for Gröning no longer belonged to the gullible or enthusiastic. For the most part, they were indifferent, skeptical, and apathetic, but still very sensitive due to the injustice they had suffered. They could only now be convinced by helpful deeds. They, the suffering, abandoned, downtrodden, who streamed together with the last hope of being healed and of receiving comfort, they all were the denouncers of an era of materialism, whose deadly betrayal in their dire need was an indisputable testimony of the times. Due to the war, they were afflicted with 1,000 wounds and untold suffering. Driven out of their homeland, abandoned in desperation and misery, they came to Gröning. In all these people lived the realization that they were fleeing from cold, heartless and godless materialism to the call of the healer of their destiny and to the return home to the merciful goodness of God.
Ich hatte eine Freundin in Salzburg und die war blind.
I had a friend in Salzburg and she was blind, and no doctor was able to help her. I had previously read newspaper reports on the events at the Traberhof in Rosenheim of the mass healings occurring through Bruno Gröning, and I dismissed them. That's impossible. It can only be a fraud. And I didn't pay any more attention.
hat mich nicht mehr interessiert.
And then my friend wrote me a letter asking me to accompany her to Munich. She didn't have anyone to accompany her, and she wanted to go to Bruno Gröning.
Sie will zu Bruno Gröning.
Really? No, impossible. I won't go. How could Maria Laufenthaler ask me to do such a thing?
What's the matter?
She's going to Gröning. Of all people, Gröning. She wants me to go with her.
Gröning? Isn't that the miracle healer?
A charlatan he is. I won't go to him.
Look, maybe he could help you also.
What nonsense. I've never heard of such a thing.
Hin und her überlegt.
I thought it over, back and forth. She didn't have anyone to go with her. And then I decided and said, I'll go.
Ich fahre.
Grete Holzbauer lived with her mother in Kärnten, Austria in 1950 when she travelled to Munich to see Bruno Gröning. And she herself was suffering from 3 incurable diseases.
Wir sind dann bei Herrn Enderlin in München, Schwabing.
We were received by Mr. Enderlin in Munich, Schwabing, in a private apartment. And that's when I decided at the door,
Ich gehe da mit hinein.
I'm going in there as well, so that I can rescue her from a charlatan. I can see, I can hear. And so they let me in.
Und so hat man mich hineingelassen.
Eugen Enderlin is a healing practitioner. Before the lecture, he asks Grete Holzbauer into an adjacent room and takes down her case history.
For 15 years, I've had chronic frontal sinusitis. The suppuration has hardened and become encrusted.
Yes.
And besides that, I have the opposite of diabetes. My blood sugar level is too low. I have to take 7 to 8 cubes of fruit sugar daily just to be able to exist. Despite that, when I'm outside on the street, if there's no wall to lean on, or a table when in a room, I end up on the floor. That's how dizzy I get.
Hypoglycemia. Anything else?
Yes, during the war in service in Yugoslavia, I developed jaundice, and there was no way to treat it. I couldn't follow a diet, and so I was left with a liver disease. I can only consume 1/3 of all types of foodstuffs. Sausage, pork and bacon are the worst things for me. The doctor said, I must follow a diet my whole life. My liver cells are destroyed.
You know, 14 days ago there was a lady from France here who had the same kind of liver problem as you. And she was healthy again in half an hour.
Excuse me? In half an hour she was healthy?
Well, just as I said to you, she came in here ill. And was healthy. Within the shortest time. With Gröning there is nothing that is impossible.
Eugen Enderlin experienced a healing of angina pectoris in 1949 at the Traberhof. Out of gratitude, he offered Bruno Gröning an apartment to use for his lectures. In the meantime, about 50 to 60 people were waiting in the living room. Before Bruno Gröning came in, Enderlin spoke to the help seekers and explained to them how they could receive the healing power.
Und irgendwann sagte er dann, denken Sie jetzt nicht
And
an
at
Ihre
some point he
Krankheit,
said,
denken Sie an was
do not
Schönes.
think about your illness, think about something beautiful or something that gives you joy. And I will never forget this. I thought about it. If I think about something beautiful, nothing bad can happen to me. I'll go along with that.
Und ich dachte an den Wörthersee.
And I thought about the Wörthersee, which I experienced on the way there. And at that moment, I had sensations in my body that were unfamiliar to me. Something was streaming through my entire body from top to bottom, all the way into my arms and through my fingertips. I thought, what's this now? Without a shot, without medicine, such sensations. And that was the first time that I received the Heilstrom.
Empfangen habe.
By Heilstrom, Bruno Gröning is referring to the spiritual power through which healings occur. He also calls it the divine power.
Dann kam Bruno Gröning selbst.
Then Bruno Gröning himself came into the room.
Nach einer Stunde circa.
And after about an hour, Mr. Gröning asked me, "How did you get to Munich?"
Und ich sagte, mit dem Zug.
And I said, "By train."
Und
And he said,
Nein.
"No, impossible, I can't."
Das waren genau die Worte.
Those were the exact words that I had said to my mother when I was reading the letter. "No, I am not going. No, impossible, I can't." The same gestures that I had used. And in that moment, I knew he sees the whole scene that played out at my house 14 days ago.
Zu Hause abgespielt hat. Ich habe mich so geschämt.
I was so ashamed that I would have preferred to just run away. And then he looked at me so lovingly and full of forgiveness and said, "It's all right, the train brought you here."
Sie hierher gebracht, ne? Und in dieser eine Minute
And at that very
habe
moment,
ich den Glauben
I took up
aufgenommen.
the faith that this man could help me.
Und nach dem Vortrag fielen alle
And
Schmerzen.
after the lecture, all pain fell away. And I got such a fresh feeling that I didn't recognize anymore because I was always so tired. And such a feeling of joy, I can't even describe it in words. And then I knew this can only be health.
Das kann nur die Gesundheit sein. Und dann ging ich.
And then I went over to Bruno Gröning and shook his hand and said, "Mr. Gröning, I thank you. I feel completely healthy now."
Und er schaute mich von oben bis unten an.
And then he looked at me from top to bottom and said, "Yes, you don't just feel healthy, you are healthy.
Aber danken Sie nicht mir.
But don't thank me, thank God. He did it."
Das konnte ich
I
überhaupt
couldn't
nicht
understand
verstehen.
that at all, because for years I hadn't believed in any God.
Mit meiner Freundin ging ich dann durch München.
With my friend, I went to the youth hostel in Munich with such a great feeling of joy, indescribable.
Und
And
sie
then
sagte
she
auf
said,
einmal,
all of a sudden, "Hey, there's red."
sag ich,
I said, "It's
Mitternacht ist
midnight.
es
It's
finster
dark
ist."
out.
Sagt sie,
She said, "No, it's red over there." And I looked intently.
intensiv, war eine rote Lichtreklame.
There was a red neon sign, and suddenly she saw all the colors of the neon sign that were visible on the street.
die auf der Straße sichtbar waren.
We felt such holiness that we could no longer speak.
When Grete Holzbauer woke up the next morning, she still had that fresh and light feeling of joy. She had no more pain, no more dizziness. She makes the most serious diet transgression when her girlfriend asks her to make a bacon sandwich.
Dann habe ich gewartet.
And then I waited to see whether I would get pains in my liver as I would have in the past. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, no pain.
Schmerz. Bin ich wirklich gesund?
Am I really healthy?
Jetzt wollte ich wissen, wie das
Then I
geht.
wanted to know how that works. How is it possible that I was healthy all of a sudden? No explanation. What did Mr. Gröning say?
Danken Sie Gott.
Thank God he did it.
Gibt es einen Gott?
Is there a God? Is there really a God?
Wo ist er?
Where is he?
Aber
But there must be one, otherwise I wouldn't be healthy now. And then I experienced something and I got this thought. Yes, there is a God. And this is the proof.
Und der ist
And he
da
is not up there like some spirit suspended in the air. He must be with me.
Und der muss in Wirklichkeit ganz lieb sein.
And he must be really loving to give me my health back without my having deserved it.
Wir blieben dann noch und konnten 3-mal im ganzen Bruno Gröning erleben bei Ennerlin.
We stayed longer, and in total we experienced Bruno Gröning 3 times at Mr. Enderlin's. The second time that we went there, we had been invited, and I experienced something special.
Kam auch in den Saal zittrig.
A woman came into the room, trembling. She inched her feet forward and needed a long time to reach her chair from the door.
Sehr lange. Mit den Händen gezittert.
Her hands trembled.
Und
And later, when Mr. Gröning came in, he gave a lecture, and in the middle of the lecture, he said,
Kommen Sie heraus.
"Come up here,
Just
just to this woman." And she got up and walked up completely normally. Well. And then he said, "Well, go ahead and walk." The people sat in their rows. "Walk along here."
Und sie ging.
And she walked. Again. Again. And now stretch your arms. She looked around. She couldn't do it.
Ja, sagte Sie können.
"Yes, you can," he said. And then, suddenly,
Noch einmal.
again,
Noch einmal.
again, down,
Nach oben.
up,
Nach rückwärts.
and to the back. And then he said, "Do some knee bends."
Sagt Herr Gröning, das kann ich nicht.
She said, "Mr. Gröning, I can't do that." And then he said, "Why not?"
Sagt Herr Gröning, ich kann das nicht. Ja, warum?
"Because the run in my stocking will get even bigger." She needed an excuse.
Wir lachten alle. Und
We all laughed, and she did knee bends. Once, twice, 3 times.
der Gröning sagte, na,
And Mr. Gröning said, "All right, now you go in the hallway and tell your husband all the things you can do."
ja, warum wissen Sie?
"But how do you know that that is my husband?" And she was out there in a flash. She was out there so fast.
Bei der Tür draußen. Der Gröning
And Mr. Gröning wanted to continue speaking when she came back in and said, "Mr. Gröning, you can't see what else I can do?" He said, "I don't have to stand at the door and watch. I can see what you're doing anyway." And we all knew without a word being uttered that she could hug her husband again.
Ja.
Yes, in a couple of minutes, this woman received a healing. And to have experienced this was truly great for me. At that time, I swore to myself that I would tell no one about this. This is too holy. I don't want to lose this. And when I got home, I wanted to visit my girlfriend in Klagenfurt. She wasn't home, but her mother was, and we were very close.
Wir waren im vertrautesten Verhältnis. Ja.
Well, how are you? You look wonderful. Where were you on vacation?
Sag mir, wo warst du denn?
Tell me where you've been.
Schau, sagt sie.
You really do look better than I have ever seen you.
Sag mir's doch.
Tell me already.
Na, dachte ich mir. Sag's dir so.
Well, I thought to myself, so tell her. And so I told her about the experience in Munich. And suddenly she said, "That's strange. My whole body is tingling."
Ich freute mich, dass sie den Heilstrom.
I was happy that she felt the Heilstrom, even though Bruno Gröning was not personally there. After 3 weeks, I was able to visit her, and she had received 3 great healings in the meantime.
Ein schweres Rheumalein.
Severe rheumatism, severe heart trouble. All of it was simply gone.
War einfach weg.
She had a fibroid tumor on her spine and couldn't bend over or stretch anymore. No doctor was able to help. And she could bend and stretch without pain. She got a complete healing for these 3 diseases.
Dieser Leiden. Und dann konnte ich nicht mehr still sein.
And then I couldn't be quiet anymore. And then I thought to myself, if that is the way this works, then I have to tell people who are in the same or worse shape.
Ja.
That's where the Pratneckers lived, the mother with her son. It was a refugee apartment because they had lost their apartment in Klagenfurt in an air raid, and so they had come to St. Veit.
Sind sie nach St. Veit gekommen. Viele Stunden verbracht bei ihnen.
We spent many hours there with them.
Wir kannten uns, weil der Sohn im Kammerchor war.
We knew each other because the son was in the chamber chorus, which I was also in. He was lame from polio. And the mother came to me and said, "I heard that you went to see a miracle doctor in Germany. Would you tell me about it so that my son Kurti can become healthy?"
Dass mein Sohn, der Kurti, gesund wird.
Ich wurde am 20.09.21.
I was born 2 months early on September the 20th, 1921 in Klagenfurt and weighed only 2¼ pounds. During my first year I became sick with polio, the consequences of which I suffered under until the year 1951.
At the age of 4, Kurt Pratnecker was put into a cast from his chest to the tips of his toes. Both legs were straddled. Later, he had to wear braces on both legs for 8 years. He had several operations. Tendons were separated or lengthened. During the war, he had 2 severe shocks to his nerves, causing everything to get even worse. He had to give up his position at the bank, and he was desperate.
Durch Vermittlung von Fräulein Grete Häusler.
Grete Holzbauer sent me the book The Great Turnaround by Kurt Trumpler to read.
Als Erfolg
Success could be detected as my health began to improve significantly.
Die Frau kam.
After 3 weeks, the woman brought the book back and said, "You know what happened? I had to lengthen his pants 4 inches.
Zentimeter verlängern. Denn es war bei ihm die Sehne verkürzt.
His tendons were too short. He couldn't stretch his legs, and that's why he walked all bent over. And now the tendon has stretched itself out, and he can walk upright. And now his pants were too short."
Sind die Hosen zu kurz geworden.
das Einwärtsdrehen, Schleifen der Beine.
My legs didn't turn inward anymore. My knees no longer knocked together. Now I can do knee bends more easily. My body doesn't lean forward and the problem with my balance has diminished. The dexterity in my fingers has also improved.
Dann ist er in die Gemeinschaft gekommen. Und
then he came into the community, and then his health improved, and the healing occurred bit by bit, so that very soon he could walk upright and up and down the stairs. It even got to the point a few years later that he took dance lessons.
Jahre später sogar Tanzkurs gemacht hat.
In May of 1953, Kurt Pratnecker wrote to Bruno Gröning,
Ich möchte Ihnen nochmals, Herr Bruno Gröning, danken.
I would like to thank you again, Bruno Gröning, for enabling the wonderful healing power of the Father to come to me, for which you are the transmitter. If you could see me, I believe, dear Mr. Gröning, that you would also be most happy with this success. Thanks to your kindness, I've been healed of 30 years of illness. At any rate, I owe you my deepest gratitude and wish you God's blessing for your continuing work.
Und da sind Leute zu mir gekommen.
And then people came to me so that now I could report.
Es waren 40 bis zum Jahre 2.
There were 40 up until the year 1952, and half had received complete healing, and the other half were right in the middle of healing, and they wanted to meet Bruno Gröning. I invited him, and he came, and he was my guest for 3 days.
3 Tage mein Gast. Ich habe im Gasthaus Löschnig.
I reserved a separate room in the Löschnig guest house for his lecture. I invited a few people, and everyone brought so many people from all over the place.
Da war das Extrazimmer, das wir gemietet hatten für den Vortrag.
That's where the extra room was, which we rented for his lecture. And at 7 o'clock in the evening, Mr. Gröning came with me, and there were about 50 people in the room, and he gave a wonderful lecture.
Wir sind dann nach Hause, es war circa Mitternacht.
Then we went home, it was about midnight, and Mr. Gröning spoke with my mother and me until 4 in the morning.
In diesen Nachtstunden,
during those hours, Mr. Gröning gave me a picture. Actually, it was this one here.
Und am nächsten Tag,
and on the next day, we were supposed to start at 3 o'clock, when Mr. Gröning said,
sagte Herr Gröning, und Sie fahren voraus.
You go ahead, I'll follow. And when I got there, I thought, what's going on? Cars, people. Where do they all come from? What do they want? Well, they had come for Bruno Gröning's lecture. A policeman approached me.
Miss Holzbauer.
Yes?
I must talk to you. Please come into the restaurant with me. I've been instructed to tell you the following. Mr. Gröning is forbidden to speak and heal. When he comes, then bring him to the police station next door. He's not allowed in the hall, and he's not allowed to speak to the people.
What? For what reason? Why not?
You'll hear all about it.
But he hasn't done anything. It isn't against the law. What does this mean?
Also ich war derart erschrocken.
Well, I was so shocked and so desperate. You'll hear about it, and that's it.
Und ich ging dann
I felt desperate as I went out, just when Bruno Gröning showed up.
Die Leute herum.
People all around. I said, Mr. Gröning, you may not go in there. You've been forbidden to speak. Speaking and healing ban. You must accompany me to the police station. I was so upset. And then he comforted me. Very calmly he said, "It's okay. I've known for a long time that it would come to this."
Auf jeden Fall, wir sind dann da hochgegangen zur
At any rate, we went up to the police station, and the officer in charge said, "Mr. Gröning, this is not my doing. Rather, I have received an order, and that is why I must tell you that you are not permitted in the room, you are not permitted to speak there, nor to heal."
Dürfen nicht sprechen und nicht heilen. And
Mr. Gröning said, "It is not necessary that I go there. You go down there." "Come," he said. "No, not me." "Yes," he said. "What must happen will happen."
When is Gröning coming?
The police have picked him up.
What?
The health department officials are behind this.
So, wer soll jetzt da heruntergehen?
So, who is going to go down there? And they decided, the police, that I would be permitted to go, so I was allowed.
Also ich darf.
I'm sorry that you've come all this way for nothing. But Mr. Gröning is not allowed to come. They have forbidden him to. He may not speak to you. Please leave. Go back home again.
You could speak to us instead.
Yes, tell us something about Gröning.
All right. In 1950, when I went to Munich to see Bruno Gröning, I was very skeptical at first. I thought Mr. Gröning was a charlatan, and I wanted to protect my friend from him. But when I went back home again, I was healed. I'd had 15 long years of chronic sinusitis.
Suddenly, in the last row, a woman fainted. A man caught her, and after only a minute she cried out, "I have been healed! I am healed! I am healed!"
Ich bin geheilt, ich bin geheilt.
And he was a famous painter, well known all over the place, and it happened just to his wife. Later he painted Bruno Gröning himself. The healing started here, and in a short time she received a complete healing from a most incurable disease.
Von einer unheilbaren Krankheit.
And then, when the lecture was over, everything fell away. And suddenly I had a wonderful feeling. So light. And such a feeling of joy. And I knew this can only be good health. And when Mr. Gröning came to the door again,
My shoes
I
are
went
so
to
loose.
him and
Tie them up
said,
for me.
Mr.
Mother, your
Gröning,
shoes
Mr.
are
Gröning,
tied.
I thank you. I feel completely healthy now. And then he looked me over from top to bottom and said, yes, you don't just feel healthy, you are as well. But don't thank me for it. Thank God. He did it.
My shoes need to be tied. They're too loose. Please tie them up.
But Mother, your shoes are already
What are you
tied.
talking about? Be quiet, you're disturbing us. I couldn't understand it at all. Because for years, I didn't believe in any God.
Ich kannte die Frau.
I knew the woman because I had visited her often up there on the mountain where she lived on a farm.
Besucht hatte. Die hatte Wassersucht.
She had edema. Her body was all swollen and her legs were so thick that no shoes fit her.
Dass in keine Schuhe hineinkam. Und mit Stücken.
And she hobbled in with canes and talked a blue streak.
I said, it is midnight. It is dark.
Tie my shoes for me. They're so
What's
loose.
the matter? Please be quiet.
Mother, your legs are so thin.
Und dann guckten wir alle.
And then we all looked, and the fat legs, the thighs, the calves were now thin. And then the shoes were so wobbly, and the mother was saying to the daughter, tie my shoes are off, put my shoes back on.
Die Schuhe sind ausgezogen. Steck mir die Schuhe an.
And she looked, Mother, your shoes are on. And that was the chatter. And then we all stared, and I, as naive as I was, looked for the puddle. The water had to be visible on the floor somewhere. But of course it wasn't visible.
Irgendwo sichtbar sein. War natürlich nicht sichtbar. Und die ist dann schlank.
And she walked out of that lecture thin. Another one had a hump on her back, such a lump.
What did you feel?
I feel a very pleasant and warm feeling in my body. And now I feel so fresh and well.
Great. I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
What do you feel?
Yeah, it's really unusual. There's a tingling in my hands and my feet.
That's the Heilstrom. Let it tingle.
Okay, thank you.
And what about you?
There's rumbling in my belly. It's rumbling all over. Just rumbling everywhere.
Then let it rumble. I wish for you that you become completely free.
Thank you.
Die hat dann
She got a complete healing in a very short time.
volle Heilung gehabt. Der Rücken ist
Her back straightened out. She could work again. She could do her housework. She could even work in the fields.
Aufs Feld gehen arbeiten. Solche Dinge sind da geschehen.
Such things happened during this lecture with this picture.
Mit diesem Bild. Wir sind auf dem
We're in the
Hauptplatz.
main square of St. Veit, and that's where the painter named Knaus lived, whose wife received such a great healing. And out of gratitude, he painted a beautiful portrait of Bruno Gröning.
Dann ein schönes Bild gemalt von Bruno Gröning.
In that house lived an expert seamstress who wanted to become well and who at that time in 1952 had asked that when Mr. Gröning visited me, whether he could visit her.
Sie hatte nämlich ein Bein kürzer.
She had one leg shorter than the other for decades, since her youth, and she always limped.
Gehinkt. Und kam und hat sich lange unterhalten.
And he came and they talked for a long time. And Mr. Gröning said goodbye, and on the next day, at 5 in the morning, she woke up and had such terrible pain, and when she got up, her leg had become several inches longer, so that it was normal, and she could walk straight again.
Das ist normal war. Und so konnte sie gerade gehen. Als Bruno Gröning dann nach Hause fuhr, kam ein Reporter.
When Bruno Gröning went home, a reporter came to me and wrote an article with a big headline, Bruno Gröning in Austria. Even printed an extra edition.
Und hat auch dann
And then he took down my healing report, but mixed it all up.
Auf jeden Fall nach diesem Artikel.
At any rate, after this article appeared in the newspaper, so many people contacted me from Austria that in the shortest time, I was able to set up 23 communities.
Aufbauen konnte. Und so fing es in Österreich an.
And that is how it started in Austria, that we built up an entire work of Bruno Gröning here, held community hours, and hundreds of healings occurred, even though Bruno Gröning was not personally present.
Obwohl dann Bruno Gröning nicht persönlich da war.
It took a lot of devotion and determination to build up 23 communities in Austria at the beginning of the 1950s, without cars or telephones. But the indefatigable Grete Holzbauer was constantly on the road, giving introductions in which she told of her own healings, and holding community hours where she delved into Bruno Gröning's teaching. She took the train to Klagenfurt, Bruck an der Mur, Graz, Vienna, and down as far as Trieste in Italy. But Bruno Gröning did not forsake her. He sent her a helper from Germany.
Good day, Mr. Bavai. A heartfelt welcome to Austria. It's so nice that you've come.
I'm so happy that I can help.
Come along.
Weil ich so jung und unerfahren war, hat Herr Gröning...
Because I was so young and inexperienced, Mr. Gröning sent me Mr. Bavai. He was one of his best helpers, the community leader in Rosenheim.
Good day, Miss Holzbauer. How nice of you to
Greetings,
come.
Mrs. Meyer. It's a pleasure. I brought someone for you today. This is Mr. Bavai. He's come especially from Rosenheim.
Welcome, Mr. Bavai.
Thanks.
Hat multiple Sklerose gehabt.
He had had multiple sclerosis, and he told me that during the war he went from one military hospital to another and was unable to fight. He got progressively worse, and they had to leave their home at the end of the war, and that they ended up in Rosenheim. At any rate, he was severely disabled.
War schwerst gehbehindert.
In late summer of 1949, when Erich Bavai found out about the occurrences at the Traberhof in Rosenheim, his wife brought him there.
Sie beide standen mitten
They both stood in the middle of the masses when Bruno Gröning was here, and it was suddenly announced, Mr. Gröning is leaving.
weg. Und sie lief dann...
And she ran through the crowd to the house where Bruno Gröning's car was coming out, and she stormed up to the car and reached out her hand to Mr. Gröning.
Hat dann Herrn Gröning die Hand gereicht. Ist gestanden.
He stood up in the car and reached out his hand to her. Mr. Gröning, please help my husband, help my husband. And then he seized her hand, and she ran along with the car as long as she could. And he said to her, everything will be all right. Just believe.
Glauben Sie nur.
Ich selbst verspürte in meinem Körper...
I myself felt a current in my body. And from that, all kinds of things came about. It affected my whole body.
Es arbeitete im ganzen Körper. Ich möchte heute sagen, der ganze...
I could say today that my whole being was turned upside down.
Ich konnte nächsten Tag dann nochmals...
The next day, I was able to attend the mass gathering and was able to leave the Traberhof free and with my cane held high.
Und frei verlassen.
Der kam nach St. Veit.
He came to St. Veit, and then he accompanied me to every community. And that was wonderful support and assistance for the continued development.
Dann für den weiteren Aufbau. Es kam so, dass ich von Kärnten aus, wo ich zu Hause war,
It came about that from Kärnten, where I lived and where I had my communities, I met friends who were interested. I came to Vienna, and a community arose.
und in diese Gemeinschaft,
And this community met in this private house of the Constant family. They were our hosts.
das waren unsere Gastgeber. Es war so,
It was such that I went there every third week and held the community hour. And more friends came, and still more friends, and healings occurred.
es traten Heilungen ein. Ja,
Yes,
da hat sich's zugetragen.
this is where it all took place.
Da hat
It
sich's
really
zugetragen.
happened.
Da sind die
There the
Freunde
friends
gesessen
sat in the community,
Da
and
bin
that's
ich
where I
jede dritte
stood
Woche
every 3
gestanden.
weeks.
Ich kam immer von St. Veit hierher gefahren.
I always came from St. Veit on the Blue
mit dem
Lightning.
blauen Blitzauto ganz
I didn't have a
damals noch
car
klein
back
für
then.
mich.
And here
war
we
die
had the community hour.
Gemeinschaftsstunde.
Annemarie Winter was among the friends from the Vienna community. Being a nurse, she was very interested in Bruno Gröning's work.
Frau Annemarie Winter hat jetzt bei Bruno Gröning erfahren,
Annemarie Winter learned from Bruno Gröning that one could do einstellen for other people. That means that one can direct one's request to God so that another person can also receive the Heilstrom through Bruno Gröning in order to attain healing. And she used that in her profession.
und das hat sie jetzt in ihrem Beruf angewandt. Sie war in einer Station tätig. Und zwar
She worked in a hospital ward where the most severe cancer cases were admitted and treated.
Und sie hat sich eingestellt
And she did einstellen and experienced that people received complete healing.
After Bruno Gröning told me that I should turn to him when I stood in front of a patient and needed help, I made use of this at work. I experienced some very unusual things there. That is to say that diagnoses suddenly weren't right anymore. The doctor expected from those patients who had always had bad results of blood tests that results would be the same. A little better, a little bit worse, but not suddenly all better. That was unusual, and it was remarkable.
Und das war auffallend. Eine Patientin wird sofort ins Krankenhaus eingeliefert.
There was a patient who had been brought immediately to the hospital because she had stomach or intestinal cancer. I can't remember exactly what it was, and was supposed to have an operation.
Sie wurde ins Krankenhaus aufgenommen.
She was admitted to the hospital, and she came back after a few days with new x-rays and said they couldn't find anything on it. There is nothing to be done. I have the report and the x-ray. One cannot see anything on it. There must have been a mix-up.
Und das wurde bekannt im Krankenhaus.
And it became known that there were people in the hospital that were suddenly getting well. And one day, the door to the office of Dr. Popsch, head physician of the department, was a little ajar.
For a very specific reason. Our hospital is haunted. One day, the examination results are unequivocally bad. Cancer in an advanced stage. The next day, the patient is healthy. Can someone explain this to me?
Und da erzählten sie.
And then they told him that on their wards the same thing was happening.
Die Schwester hat dann den nächsten Tag.
And then the nurse asked to have a talk with the professor the next day.
Und da konnte ich das erste Mal mit ihm über Bruno.
And that was the first time I could speak to him about Bruno Gröning, that I'd been there and that I'd met him. And at first he didn't really take it seriously. But after a longer conversation, he said he would like to meet Bruno Gröning.
Nach längeren Gesprächen hat gesagt, würde Bruno Gröning gern kennenlernen. Und als ich das nächste Mal bei Bruno Gröning...
And the next time I was at the community hour with Bruno Gröning, I asked whether I could also bring my boss to the smaller circle.
Bringen dürfen. Und da war der Chef dann das erste Mal bei Bruno.
And then my boss was there for the first time and conducted a long conversation with him. He was open to it, and he also permitted me to do Einstellen for the patients.
Auf den Patienten. Und wir haben gemeinsam dann die Befunde.
Together we observed the results to see whether someone got better here and there or whether they got healed at all. He then became very interested in all that, and he came regularly to the evenings.
Und ist auch regelmäßig dann zu den Abenden gekommen.
When Professor Popsch visited Bruno Gröning's lecture for the first time, Annemarie Winter's daughter was also present.
She was an 8 or 9-year-old girl, and she was cross-eyed from birth, and no doctor had been able to help her. She was cross-eyed.
Kein Arzt konnte ihr helfen, sie schielte. Und dieses Mädchen hat auch hier die vollkommene Heilung erlebt.
And this girl also received complete healing here. And Bruno Gröning called her up during the lecture, set her on a chair, and showed everyone present this girl. And she reported that she had received a healing.
Dass sie die Heilung bekommen hat.
On another evening, Professor Popsch brought a young colleague with him to Bruno Gröning's lecture.
Der junge Arzt sagte dann, Herr Gröning.
The young doctor then said, Mr. Gröning, I have until now always seen it as my most important duty to tell the patient the whole truth. What is ailing him? What kind of disease he has? The exact diagnosis. And out of your lecture, I infer now that that is not right. And I now understand what you mean by it. That one should not say this to a person. For example, you have cancer in its most advanced stage. And because I understand it, I will not do it anymore.
Und Bruno lächelte so und sagte, na.
And Bruno smiled and said, well, the harm you have done with your exactitude, you can't see it on the outside of a person, what's going on in the inside, when you give them such a hard-hitting diagnosis. Even though it is the truth, but that is what really happens.
Die Wahrheit ist. Aber was sich hier abspielt.
Yes, he said, I understand that. Such a person will take in fear, will become despondent, And when he doesn't know about it, he is able to believe more readily that he can be helped.
Dear Mrs. Schusser, you cannot take Mina home with you. I have already told you that.
Of course I can. You aren't able to help her.
Mrs. Schusser, it's impossible.
Doctor, Mina is my child, and if I want to take her with me, then take her I will.
Listen to me. If you take Mina with you, then she could possibly die. Is that what you want? She must rest. She will not survive the trip.
Come, Mina.
Mrs. Schusser, you can't do that. You can't take her with you.
I'm taking you home now.
Mina Schusser had already received the last rites when her mother took her out of hospital and brought her home. The doctor's diagnoses disagreed. One spoke about joint inflammation, the other about tuberculosis of the bone. No hope remained. On September the 2nd, 1952, Grete Holzbauer visited the Schusser family. Mina's former teacher had asked her to. At this point, Mina had been totally lame for 4.5 years.
Wir waren angemeldet und in so einem Strecksessel.
We had been announced, and Mina was sitting in a recliner in the kitchen. It was incredibly hot inside, and she was wearing a sweater and a vest. She had shrunk down to 80 pounds. My mother will be here right away. Just wait a moment.
Also Frau Pratnecker und ich guckten nur.
Well, Mrs. Pratnecker and I just stared, shaken by the sight of her.
Und dann kam die Mutter.
And then the mother came and said, "Come into this room." And she led us into the bedroom. And then I said, "But I want to be with your daughter. I'll bring her to you."
Wir setzten uns dort nieder.
We sat down there, and then, I'll never forget that image. She took the daughter like this, from the back. And then she was hanging on her. And then she set her on the bed, and she couldn't move at all.
Und sie konnte sich nicht rühren. Sie hat den Oberkörper.
She lay her upper body back and then put her legs up so that she could lie down there. I looked around. There was a picture over the bed of a blooming young girl, a girl of around 20, something like that.
Ein Mädchen, so in 20 Jahren, ne? Sowas. Und dann sagte ich, ist das Ihre Schwester?
And then I said, "Is that your sister?" She answered, "No, that was she herself."
Jetzt fing die auf einmal schreien an.
All of a sudden she started to scream. Her mother was thoroughly horrified at what I was doing to her daughter, but I hadn't touched her. Although I had the picture of Bruno Gröning, which I had been given and took everywhere with me, and had laid it on her bedspread and had put her hands on it. And the mother was startled, and I said, "Don't be afraid. Take this picture and pay attention to what you feel."
Sie spüren werden. Sie setzte sich hinten hin.
She sat down and took the picture, and suddenly she said, "Oh, there are ants in my whole body, ants all over my body." She had such a feeling, and in this way she had received the Heilstrom. I said, "You see, you are healthy, and this is the Heilstrom," because I had just started to report and tell about it.
Und das ist der Heilstrom. Und dieser Heilstrom zieht.
And I said, "And this Heilstrom is streaming into your daughter's body and will clean out what is in there, the appearance of lameness that is the evil. And that hurts. And that is why she's crying out. Go ahead and let her scream." And I kept talking very loudly. Well, after about a quarter of an hour, she calmed down and I kept talking. When I was finished, we wanted to go home, and then Mrs. Schusser said, "Come, sit down at the table. I'll bring you some coffee." So we sat down there, Mrs. Pratnecker and I, waited for the mother. And Mina was there in the bed. All of a sudden she sat up. Suddenly she raised her legs, stretched them out.
Look what I can do.
My goodness, that was such an experience.
I'm healthy. I'm healthy.
No, Mina. Don't. Mina, the seed has been sown. Good health in your body, like a grain of seed that one has planted in a garden, and that will open up and sprout first, and then the plant will grow. I wish for you that your little plant will blossom completely, and that you experience complete health again and total happiness.
Und dann sage ich so,
and then I said, and so I wish you all the best, and after 3 weeks, report to me, write to me, or make sure that I find out somehow how you are doing.
There's a Mrs. Schusser here for you.
Miss Holzbauer, I'm so glad that you're here. I must tell you something.
How nice to see you, Mrs. Schusser. Please take a seat.
Thank you. You won't believe it, but Mina is healthy.
What?
Yes, Mina is simply healthy. After you had left with Mrs. Pratnecker, Mina was hungry. That hadn't happened before at all. Now she eats almost too much. And her buttocks have filled out and become round.
Buttocks?
Yes. Instead of buttocks, she was so bony. She was all skin and bones, and she lay there all sore and bloody. And now the wounds have healed up, and her buttocks have gotten really round.
But that's really wonderful.
Just imagine. She could already get up after only 1 week. And in the meantime, she even helps with simple tasks. Miss Holzbauer, this is a miracle. This is a truly divine miracle.
Later, she also came once to Rosenheim, and Mr. Gröning had never met her. And she sat in the first row, and in the middle of the lecture, Mr. Gröning said, "Come up here and tell us how you got your healing." She was such a shy country girl. She had never spoken in front of people and started stuttering and was so awkward. And Mr. Gröning said, "Would you like me to report about it? And you can correct me if I make a mistake." She sat down and he told us, just like that, exactly how everything had transpired. And then he dropped his keys. She jumped up and picked them up for him so that everyone could see that she could really bend, she could stand, she could walk. And then he took a little picture out of his jacket pocket. We had sent it to him earlier with the thank you note. He had been carrying her picture in his breast pocket.
Hatte das Bild in seiner Brusttasche getragen gehabt. Herr Barbe hat uns Österreicher eingeladen.
Mr. Barwey had invited us Austrians. When Bruno Gröning was giving a lecture in Rosenheim, we were allowed to come along. We rented a whole car on the train, We started at 7 o'clock in the morning from St. Veit, and more friends joined us along the way.
Und dann war ein alter Herr.
And then there was an old gentleman who was very burdened, who came up to me and said, "I can't stand it anymore. I can't sit any longer in this compartment. I'm going out to stand by the open window in the corridor. I'm sure I'm going to die. If only I hadn't come along. I'm dying."
Ich muss sterben.
I said, "Oh no, one doesn't die that fast while going to see Bruno Gröning." He wouldn't listen to me. I left him with Mrs. Barwey, and she comforted him.
Und als wir dann nach Hause fuhren,
on the way back home, I asked him, "Well, I see you didn't die. How do you feel now?" He said, "I got a complete healing. I feel so good I can't describe it. I have lost all the bad things, all the pain, everything. I feel heavenly. I'm so happy that I was allowed to come along."
Ein andermal waren wir wieder nach Rosenheim gefahren mit wenigen Freunden.
Another time, we went to Rosenheim again with a few friends, and at that time there were no rooms available. And a friend, who was a carpenter, let us use his workshop.
Und zur Verfügung gestellt in der Rosenheimer Gemeinschaft.
Professor Hohlmann was also in the Rosenheim community. He was very involved with spirituality, and he also sat inside. The door was still open, and we could see that Mr. Gröning was already standing in front of the open door. And Mr. Hohlmann then spoke to us and said, "You know, spiritually speaking, we live in an ice age. In an ice age, that is how far humanity has fallen. And here comes Bruno Gröning. And what that means is that the iceberg disappears and everything changes." That's how he spoke. And we stared and looked at Hohlmann, and then we saw that Bruno Gröning was outside smiling. And suddenly he came in.
Und dann hat gesprochen.
And then he spoke.
Und das war eigenartig.
And it was peculiar. He never did that before. He said in the course of the lecture, "So I'm giving to you. Pay attention to what you feel." And I'll never forget it. I felt something that I had never felt before. There were some centers that opened up. That's what it felt like, just as if flowers spring open from a bud. That's the kind of feeling I had.
So ein Gefühl hatte ich. Und ein Mann.
And a man, Mr. Tiefenthaler, he was severely ill. He started to groan. Making all kinds of sounds for about 5 minutes. And suddenly he stopped groaning and said, "Now I can breathe freely. Now I'm free. I'm free." And indeed, through that experience, he received a complete healing.
Und Herr Gröning,
and Mr. Gröning went back and forth, and then he went to the radio. He put his hand very briefly on it, and then the radio began to play, without his having turned it on. Mr. Hohlmann jumped up. Dear friends, do you know what this means? Do you know what this means?"
Wisst ihr, was das bedeutet? Was Herr Gröning kann?
What Mr. Gröning can do.
Der Gröning stand und lächelte.
And Mr. Gröning stood there and smiled, and then he very calmly went over there again, laid his hand very briefly on the radio, and then it stopped playing.
Dann hat aufgehört zu spielen. Er ist Herr der Materie.
He is master over matter, Mr. Hohmann said. Do you understand what we have been allowed to witness?
Und dann ist Herr Gröning auch zu einem Mann hingegangen.
And then Mr. Gröning went over to a man and told him every crime he had committed during the war. Presumably he had been deployed in Russia as a soldier, and he told him everything. The man was ashamed of himself. He was so ashamed. He said, "Yes, that's right. I did do that. I did think that. I did say that." And then he said, "It's good that you now recognize it and regret it. You shouldn't have done it."
Das hätten Sie nicht tun sollen.
And then we knew without a doubt that God forgives when a person recognizes and regrets it.
Wir hatten wunderbare Stunden erlebt hier.
We experienced wonderful hours here in Rosenheim during the lectures. And then the train went back at 11:30, and at about 6 o'clock in the morning it arrived in St. Veit. I washed, breakfasted, and went to school. And I could teach without having slept, no problems. I took a nap in the afternoon, and all exhaustion was overcome.
Nachmittag einen Mittagsschlaf und alle Strapazen waren überwunden.
From time to time, Bruno Gröning came to Austria to visit the communities, sometimes even unannounced.
Das war Sonntagabends.
It was a Sunday evening after the community hour, around 10 o'clock, that someone told me that Mr. Gröning would be in Villach tomorrow. He is expecting you in the evening.
Ich war derart überrascht.
I was so surprised because I knew he was forbidden to enter Austria. And during that time there was a great deal of disparaging press against Bruno Gröning. Not just derogatory things, lies, slander of the worst kind.
Schlimmster Art. Aber in Villach sagte Herr Gröning dann mir,
But in Villach, Mr. Gröning said to me, "Please accompany me tomorrow to Mr. Schiller's."
war der Herausgeber.
He was the publisher of a magazine, Man and Destiny.
Und während des Gespräches
And during the conversation, I understood that Mr. Gröning was asking him to write the truth about him and publish an article about him in his magazine.
aufnehmen.
It was really hard for me when I realized that Bruno Gröning was coming as a petitioner to Mr. Schiller.
Zu dem Herrn Schiller kam.
He was asking that people write the truth about him. That touched my heart deeply.
The press reports on Bruno Gröning in the 50s were predominantly pejorative and negative. Hardly any journalists made the effort to get the facts about Gröning. In 1957, an unusually positive series of articles appeared. The physician and medical journalist Dr. Horst Labenske did very careful research for the periodical Das Neue Blatt. And not only did he visit Bruno Gröning, but also several communities and people who had been healed, including some in Vienna.
Der Herr Labenske hatte auch die Vollmacht.
Dr. Labenske had the authority to go to the doctors, and after that he went to the doctors with these addresses here in Vienna and inquired about the state of these people's health and found out how sick they really had been. And based on this, he reported about the healings in his article.
Hat dann von der Heilung in seinem Artikel berichtet.
And I was allowed to be there and was so happy that through this magazine, das neue Blatt, so many people would find out about what was really happening.
In 1950, Bruno met the Frenchwoman Josette Dufossé.
When he saw her for the first time, he said, "I have been waiting a long time for you." At the first meeting.
As Josette supported him a great deal in the building up of his work and assisted him in many ways, they grew close. In June of 1955, they were about to get married. The guests had already assembled in Bruno Gröning's living room.
Wir waren gemütlich beisammen.
We had all gathered together comfortably and were ready to go into the church. When the Riedingers arrived from Karlsruhe, very close friends. And while they were saying hello, "Mr. Gröning," the woman says, "Mr. Gröning, all the best, but I have a request."
Aber ich habe eine Bitte. Würden Sie sich für diese Frau
Would you do einstellen for this woman? Would you help that woman? Would you help this man? And Mr. Schmidt interrupted and said, "Mrs. Riedinger, today is Mr. Gröning's day off. At least let him have some peace today and don't ask him to work."
wenigstens heute in Ruhe und bitten Sie nicht, dass wirken soll.
And we watched him. What would happen next? How would he react? And he said, "Leave it be, Mr. Schmidt. It's the most wonderful thing when I am allowed to work. Please continue, Mrs. Riedinger." And so they went together in front of the balcony door, and there she could make her requests.
Und da konnte sie ihre Bitten anbringen.
And afterwards he stood up and he said, "So, now we can go."
It was June the 26th, 1955, when Bruno Gröning and Josette Dufossé got married in Plochingen.
Da in der dritten Reihe.
There I sat with Mr. Bavai in the third row. The bridal pair here in the front.
Das Brautpaar hier vorne.
The wedding ceremony was performed, and suddenly the organ started to sound out. And Baroness Annie Ebner von Eschenbach started to play along on the violin. And then came the most important word. The minister asked the bride, she said, "I do." And then he, Bruno Gröning, was asked, and he said, "I do."
Ja. Die Trauung Bruno Grönings war beendet in der Kirche.
Bruno Gröning's wedding in the church was over, and the newlyweds led the way to the house with us friends following. There was a special ambience, and here, in this place, there was a rose arch, partly overgrown.
Bewachsen.
And then the newlyweds stood under it to be photographed. And that was a special moment for the friends. Because the arch is the gate into the spiritual realm. And coincidentally, here was the rose arch under which the newlyweds were standing in order to go into the future.
In die Zukunft zu gehen. Ich durfte einige Male von Österreich.
I was allowed to come from Austria several times to visit Bruno Gröning here in his house. And one time, a very close friend, a Miss Faller, was also here, and I was able to get to know her. She was a close friend.
Und durch eine
Through a bomb attack, she had lost her home, which had been totally destroyed, and in that apartment had been her daughter, her only daughter, and she had lost her life. And she said, I lost everything. I lost my home, my daughter, my job, my homeland. And then I arrived in Stuttgart. Above all, I had lost my health.
Vor allem habe ich meine Gesundheit verloren.
In the end, the doctor said I only had 3 weeks left to live. And then I visited a lecture of Bruno Gröning's. And at the end of the lecture, I walked out the door healthy again. And since then, I got everything back. Through my restored health, I could work. I was able to get an apartment again and can manage, and I live well.
That is just wonderful. At home in Austria, there are also so many wonderful things happening. We have over 20 communities. And healings upon healings have occurred, hundreds of healings, and this without Bruno Gröning even being there personally.
Plötzlich kam Herr Gröning dann die Treppe herunter.
Suddenly, Mr. Gröning came down the steps and looked at us. And then she said, Mr. Gröning, Miss Holzbauer sure has a lot to tell about Austria. I was still called Miss Holzbauer back then, before I got married. It's wonderful what she has told me about.
Das ist ja wunderbar, was sie alles erzählt. Und dann schauten wir uns an.
And then we looked at each other. I was looking Mr. Gröning in the eyes, and he in mine. And I will never forget this moment for the rest of my life. I said, Mr. Gröning, I don't do anything. I can't do anything anyway. I simply ask you to help and heal, and then these things happen.
Helfen und heilen. Und dann geschehen diese Dinge. Und dann sagte er,
and then he said,
ja,
yes,
Sie bitte,
you request,
und ich tue
and I
es.
do it.
Ein andermal war ich auch da.
Another time, I was also there, and most of the friends had left.
Und das sagte Bruno
And
Gröning.
Bruno Gröning said, come, that was right here.
Und das sagte er,
And then he said, I would like us to speak to each other on a first name basis, not with wine and a kiss and a hug,
Umarmung und Kuss.
but with all my heart. Then he extended his hand to me and said, Du, to me. And then I was allowed to address Bruno with an informal you.
Das ist mir so schwer
That was
gefallen.
quite difficult because respect is so important to me. And crossing this hurdle was difficult to overcome.
War für mich eine Überwindung.
And since then, I have been allowed to call him Bruno, and he called me Grete. Sometimes he had to admonish me, and he said, stop, you must say Bruno to me now.
Kreise um sich.
He had circles of people around him, really close friends, friends that he scraped together around him. There were not very many. These were the only ones who said "du" to him, that I was allowed to be in it, in the innermost circle that was a special grace. But all the things that I had to experience later, how even some of his closest friends worked against Mr. Gröning because they didn't understand what it was all about. That was what hurt me the most. There.
Da ist der Stumpenhof.
There is the Stumpenhof.
Und da war auch ein Saal.
And there was a hall where the board meetings for the Gröning Union took place.
Stattgefunden des Gröning-Bundes. Das erste Mal.
The first time that I experienced something like this and had gotten to know a few of the friends who were still strangers to me at the time. There weren't many. And among others, there was Mr. Häusler.
Und dann ist mir aufgestoßen.
And then it hit me what this man was saying. He used a sort of jargon.
Im Jargon.
Well, Bruno, you are responsible for the spiritual stuff and the healings, but you don't understand anything about money. That's what I am responsible for. I thought to myself, what is he talking about? That really hit me right in my heart.
Etwas später hat Bruno Gröning then...
A little while later, Bruno Gröning spoke to me alone and he said, well, what did you notice about Mr. Häusler during the board meeting?
Herr Gröning.
I said, Mr. Gröning. At that time, I was still on a last-name basis with him. Mr. Gröning. I found it so insolent that Mr. Häusler said, you don't understand anything about money. I'll manage that.
Das werde ich machen. Na, war...
Well, he had been a bank director from a worldly standpoint. And I said, that's not true, Mr. Gröning. That really isn't right.
Und dann sagte in aller Ruhe.
And then he said, completely calm, but resolutely, what would happen if I couldn't calculate? God calculates differently than the rest of the world. It's like this. When one puts a seed in the earth, for instance, a kernel of grain, and from this one seed a stalk grows, and an ear develops with 30 seeds, and if you put these 30 seeds into the earth, every seed produces another 30. That is how God calculates in all matters. In all matters, he said.
In allem, sagt er.
When Grete Holzbauer came to Bruno Gröning, she had a lot of questions. She was also very preoccupied with death. She remembered her grandfather's funeral when she was 12 years old.
Ich konnte es nicht fassen.
I couldn't understand it, that my grandfather was lying in a coffin and that we had to take him to the cemetery. I was stunned and completely overcome with grief and pain. And somehow I took that with me until I was able to come to Bruno Gröning's community. I had the opinion that it was something terrible.
Die Auffassung, dass es was Schlimmes ist. Kinder müssen sterben, junge Menschen müssen sterben.
Children must die, young people must die, old people have to stay alive even though they want to die but can't. How did God come up with this? And I didn't get an answer for many years.
Jahre nicht. Aber im letzten Jahr,
but in the last year, when I was able to be with Bruno Gröning in Mimizan in France, he started on his own to give me the answer.
Einfach und schlicht.
Very simply, he said, at the hour of birth, every human being receives his hour of death. And in fact, from God himself. And no one can get around this. No one is allowed to take his own life.
Das darf kein Mensch.
Let's say grace. Come, Lord. Please be our guest and bless what you have shared with us.
Amen.
Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.
In St. Veit waren damals 3 Schwestern.
In St. Veit, back then, there were 3 sisters, and one of them had been lame with multiple sclerosis for over 12 years and could only sit and be fed.
Is it good?
Good.
Die Gesunde, die hat diese...
The healthy one looked after the lame one for over 12 years and helped her with everything.
Und dann ist sie heimgegangen, gestorben.
And then she went home. She died.
Und für uns war das ein...
And this was quite an experience for us, because there was no grieving.
Wir haben sie geistig dann...
We felt her spiritually, and that was such a joy that she could be in the hereafter, in the kingdom of heaven.
Diese Schwester...
This sister visited Bruno Gröning, and we hadn't seen him beforehand. He couldn't have found out from us.
Von unserer Seite aus.
Suddenly he looked at us, and then he said, so full of love to her, "Well, are you sad?"
Sagte Herr Gröning.
She said, "Mr. Gröning, not at all. No grief at all. I have felt absolutely no grief since she isn't here anymore. Even though I dressed her for 12 years, washed and fed her, nothing. I have done without her. As for grief, not a trace."
Keine Spur. Na ja.
Well, he said, a little bit.
Aber gönnen Sie es ihr.
But let her enjoy that she is allowed to be over there in the hereafter. It is much more beautiful there. Let her enjoy it.
Gönnen Sie es ihr. Danach durften wir...
After that, we gathered together, and in fact it was in Mr. Pelz's apartment. Just a small circle of people, very small group.
Und wir warteten auf Bruno.
And we were waiting for Bruno. And what did we talk about? About going home, about dying, and what it must be like in the hereafter. Whether we would see each other or be allowed to recognize him.
Wie wir ihn erkennen dürfen. Ihn und die.
Him and all those who will be over there when they don't have bodies anymore.
Und auf einmal kam Bruno Gröning.
And suddenly Bruno Gröning came and continued the conversation and said, "So, you want to know what it's like in the hereafter?" "Yes," he said. "You will be able to see all your loved ones again. And you ask yourselves how you will recognize them when they don't have bodies. You won't have a body either. Well, how did you recognize me?" In your hearts you recognized me, and so you will be able to recognize everyone in your hearts, and that will be lovely.
Grete Häusler experienced many more things at Bruno Gröning's side. He never disappointed her in any way, shape or form. However, in December 1958, he did not come to a Christmas celebration as promised. When she spoke to him on New Year's Eve, she didn't realize how badly he was doing, and that she would never see him again. At the end of January, she was stricken when she read in the newspaper that Bruno Gröning had died in Paris. She couldn't believe it.
Nein, haben wir gedacht, wieder einmal eine große Lüge.
No, I thought to myself, another big lie. All the lies they spread in the newspapers. And in the evening, we called Mrs. Gröning to find out whether it was true. And she said yes. It was so surprising that I had to pull myself together and do in that moment what he had taught us to do. That is, to not take on grief.
Es kam mir sofort etwas in Erinnerung, was mich so tiefst berührt hatte.
I immediately remembered something that touched me deeply when, beaming, he said once in a lecture, "My most beautiful hour of this earthly life will be when I may go home to our Father, to go home to the glory of God."
Gehen in die Herrlichkeit Gottes. Und da musste ich mich ja mitfreuen in dem Augenblick.
And then, at that moment, I had to be happy for him. I couldn't be sad when he is so happy. Such a joy overcame me, and so much love as well. I knew in that moment that he is completely with me, and no consolation was necessary.
Es bedarf keines Trostes.
After Bruno Gröning died, Grete Häusler remembered how he told about visiting a family in Paris.
Es war eine Witwe und noch einige Angehörige.
There was a widow and a few relatives, and in the middle of the conversation, Mr. Gröning said, "Your husband is sitting there." The woman said, "You don't even know that I'm a widow. My husband died. He can't be sitting there." And then Bruno Gröning smiled very modestly and mischievously and said, "Yes, he is there. And those who have passed away come to the family for as long as it takes for the relatives to continue and finish what they have started."
Und vollenden, was angefangen hat. Und ihr Mann hat etwas angefangen.
And your husband started something and was called back in the middle of it. "Yes," she said. And she told about all the things he had started. "Yes," he said, "and you will now finish these things, and then he won't come anymore." That is what Bruno Gröning told us here. And when Bruno Gröning went home, we friends knew he had started something here, setting up the divine work here in the world, his circle of friends, his work. We are the ones who remain, and we must continue the work. It is not over. It will continue.
Es geht ja weiter.
Und das, was ich bin, wozu ich hier bestimmt bin, und das will ich den engsten Freunden mit auf den Weg geben, damit sie es übernehmen und all den weiteren Nachkömmlingen, all den weiteren Menschen, die noch auf dieser Erde auch ein Leben von Gott geschenkt erhalten, dass auch sie von dieser Lehre nicht was, sondern das erfahren, was für sie hier auf dieser Erde, in diesem ihrem Erdenleben von Gott bestimmt ist.
Aber ihr sollt heute Gott erkennen, lernen, Gott erkennen können, damit ihr es den Nächsten von morgen sagen könnt.